The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on Bill 102, the Cancer Survivors Day. Mr. Speaker, there's many parents and grandparents in this chamber, and I know for parents and grandparents, we relish in the opportunity to take great pride in our kids or grandkids. And oftentimes, Mr. Speaker, that happens at a sporting event, when our children receive an academic accolade. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, when my youngest child was in primary, I received a phone call from her teacher, and it was a very powerful phone call indicating that there had been an incident in class. And I'd asked Mr. Speaker, well, what are you talking about? What's the incident you're referring to? And Mr. Speaker, I was told that the kids in class were talking about people losing their hair. So immediately I thought, well, maybe they're talking about me. But Mr. Speaker, that was not the case. The discussion was talking about different diseases and treatments for diseases. And they were talking about chemotherapy. And Mr. Speaker, when they talked about how people lose their hair as a result of chemotherapy, the kids started to laugh. And my 5-year-old daughter stood up and said to the class, "My mummy is beautiful." And Mr. Speaker, it was one of the most proudest moments of my life, where my child demonstrated a strength of character to remind her classmates that we all carry crosses. I suppose that's an appropriate term as we move into the Easter season, Mr. Speaker, that we all recognize that those that battle cancer have a support network around them, I believe, Mr. Speaker, that needs to be acknowledged. And my daughter, in that moment, reminded me how important it is to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that we as a society have all been impacted by cancer. Life takes its toll on all of us, Mr. Speaker, in its own way. And I want to thank, in a very profound way, the member for Cole Harbour-Eastern Passage and the colleagues in this House that have spoken on this bill. Because this bill acknowledges, Mr. Speaker, the journey, the fight for survival. It recognizes the determination and grit required to battle this insidious disease. I believe, Mr. Speaker, this bill recognizes the resiliency of those fighting cancer. It recognizes the love and determination and strength of character of the families and friends and the community that offers support to those when they have been diagnosed with what is to be a very, very powerful fight. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a moment and talk about what I witnessed to be resiliency and determination. To see that determination, Mr. Speaker, in a person's eyes, to see that desire to live, that desire to defeat this insidious disease, now and for future generations. And I see that, Mr. Speaker, in my own children, when I was bestowed this great honor to represent my community, when I asked my daughters, what's the first thing you want to put into that constituency office? Mr. Speaker, paintings of Terry Fox went up in the Dartmouth East office. A reminder of the legacy of that great Canadian who reminds each and every one of us, his story reminds us that it is a fight, it is a struggle, and it is something we all must be in together with those that have been diagnosed with cancer. It reminds us that we must devote our time, talent, and treasure, Mr. Speaker, to research, to ensure that future generations are not impacted by cancer. Mr. Speaker, this bill, I believe, not only reflects the desire to recognize the desire to survive, but to also thrive, to beat cancer, and to live a life that is cancer-free. And if one is living with cancer, I want those families to know they are not alone. I know all members of this chamber support them. All Nova Scotians support them. Mr. Speaker, it is my hope one day that we beat cancer into submission and obliteration. I know, as a husband to someone that went through this, I can recall I think the medical term is scanxiety. Every few months, Mr. Speaker, going and the uneasiness that used to be around the scans after treatments. This bill, Mr. Speaker, I believe, pays recognition to those individuals. The first Sunday in June is being asked to be set aside to remember those, Mr. Speaker, that are battling this and those that are supporting them. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear what we mean about support. This is a day where we reflect and honor those and their families and all the support networks who fight cancer every day. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think about one of my constituents who just last week rang that bell at the Nova Scotia Cancer Centre. Her name is Sonia Rideout. And Sonia is an amazing individual, as all fighters of cancer are. And I think about her daughter, Courtney McKenzie, who was with her all the way. It is Sonia and Courtney and the thousands of others that this bill asks, let us recognize, let us reflect, let us take some time to recognize, Mr. Speaker, that this is an insidious disease, a disease that we must always continue to fight and challenge and offer support. Mr. Speaker, this bill honors those support networks. It honors the village that must come forward to offer those that are fighting this, the family, the friends, the specialists, the advocates, the researchers, the oncologists. Oncologists, Mr. Speaker, like Dr. Daniel Rayson, his professionalism, his compassion, my family will never forget. And Mr. Speaker, all those oncologists that are with our patients from beginning to when they beat this, when they learn to live with it, and unfortunately at times at the end. And Mr. Speaker, we have amazing doctors in this province. We know it, we recognize it, and this bill acknowledges that. Over the past 24 hours, Mr. Speaker, I've been thinking of the most appropriate term that I think this bill is trying to get at, and I couldn't help but think of former U.S. President John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage. Mr. Speaker, I believe that title captures what it is we're talking about for this day. To profile courage. Those, when death is facing them, stare it down with tenacity and grit. This bill, Mr. Speaker, reminds us that even in those depths, even in those moments of treatment where it is very challenging, you do find moments of joy. You know, my late wife and I were determined, Mr. Speaker, to give our children, as much as possible, a normal upbringing. And Mr. Speaker, I recall, taking my family to Prince Edward Island, to Cavendish, in August, just to get away. This was a few days after a chemo treatment. And one of the side effects of chemo for some patients is they lose their ability to taste. And my late wife, she loved to cook. And I remember her making us some strawberry shortcake. And but because her taste had been gone, she accidentally put salt instead of sugar on. And of course, as we're eating it, my reaction was just, ah! But my children were like, Mommy, this is the best strawberry shortcake we've ever had. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, it is those tender moments that we remember and that we recognize. And to me, a bill such as this encourages Nova Scotian citizens to remember that in our daily rush to get things done, to just live, there are thousands of us in our province, thousands in our country, that require our thoughts, require our encouragement. Mr. Speaker, I'm of the opinion that this bill is in the public good. I believe it will give Nova Scotians an opportunity to pause and reflect, to use a term from John F. Kennedy, on profiles of courage. To remember, Mr. Speaker, that life is precious, that our families and friends are precious, and that all of us, as we know, have a responsibility to support those with cancer, to honor their grit, to honor their determination, to honor their resiliency, to honor those that have been impacted by the consequences of cancer. Mr. Speaker, I humbly ask for this House of Assembly to pass this bill in order to recognize the many people who now live with cancer and have survived cancer, and all those who support those with cancer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.